Okay, looks like we are live now. Welcome everyone to our May edition of the Radical Philosophy Hour. We're very happy to be here with you today. One cool thing is it's May 2nd, so we're coming right after May Day, which is, it's unfortunate, I guess, that we couldn't be doing a Radical Philosophy Hour on May Day, but nice that we get to do it the day after. Hopefully everybody has had a restful weekend and time to connect with allies, comrades, and so on. All right, so today we will be hearing from Iaan Reynolds and Anita Chari. But before we get into that, I just want to remind everybody that next month we'll be having another edition of the Radical Philosophy Hour, first Monday of the month, and it will be featuring Devanya Havas and Natifa Green. So please join us for what should be a really interesting discussion at that time. Again, 4 p.m., first Monday of the month in June. All right, so today, as I said, we're hearing from Iaan Reynolds and Anita Chari. Let me go ahead and tell you just a little bit about our presenters today. Iaan received his PhD from Villanova in 2021 and will be going to Utah Valley University's Department of Philosophy and Humanities as an assistant professor starting in the fall. So congratulations to Iaan there. His dissertation considered the relationship between ideology critique and the education of critics, splitting historical attention to Karl Popper, Theodor Adorno, and Karl Mannheim's approaches to social theory with a sensitivity to the work of education in contemporary social movements. And I think he'll be talking about something very similar today. His paper is titled The Formative Role of the Party in Lukach's Philosophy of Praxis. So we look forward to that. And then after Iaan, we'll be hearing from Anita Chari, who will be presenting a paper titled The Flexible Language of Anti-Ideology, Claire Fontaine and the Practice of Defunctionalizing Knowledge. Anita is a political theorist, somatic educator and writer based in Portland, Oregon, an associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon and co-founder of the organization Embodying Your Curriculum. Her work explores the significance of aesthetics, artistic practices, and embodiment for critical theory and practice. So I think this is going to be a really interesting and enlightening conversation. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Iaan.
Thank you so much, Brandon, and thank you so much, Anita, for being here. Really excited to be presenting my work. As you said, this is kind of coming out of my dissertation, but it's not something that is directly related to my dissertation. But I'm really excited to kind of to get some, to deal with Lukach a little bit today. Great. So I'll just actually start the paper. It's called The Formative Role of the Party in Lukach's Philosophy of Praxis. So attention to Lukach's theory of the party usually locates a dependence on an obsolete form of organization in this dimension of his early Marxist work. Goldman's work is a good example of this kind of reading. Sometimes it goes even further, finding in Lukach's party a commitment to an anti-democratic theory of political change presaging Stalinism. Some authors even draw an unbroken line leading from Lukach's treatment of the party in History and Class Consciousness's final essay to gulags, planned famines, and the later Eastern European experience of communism. So like Leszek Kolakowski is a good example of one of these readings. In this paper, I want to counter these readings by challenging some of their shared conceptual assumptions. The tendency on which these readings are based, according to which different moments of the party's development are collapsed in order to consider this organizational body as a static element in a static theory, is resisted in my paper through attention to Lukach's dialectical understanding of the party as a dynamic historical entity. So far from being a theorist of a rigid party form, I want to argue that Lukach views the party as a democratic organ of working class power, which is oriented toward a long-term process of education and self-transformation. Before turning to History and Class Consciousness's essay on the party, I'm going to examine the background against which this institution is meant to work, or namely the gap between the empirical consciousness and the imputed consciousness of the proletariat. Through attention to Lukach's broader project, we can understand de-reification as a process of developing mediations that allow the working class to move from its spontaneous awareness of the class antagonism to the revolutionary consciousness of a class for itself. If we see the party's role as a cultivation of mediations, this allows us in the next section to understand the specific way in which the party wages a constant struggle against capitalist society's conditioning force on its members. The party is an institution dedicated to the struggle against immediacy and spontaneity, a struggle conceived as the cultivation of consciousness among its members and throughout the entire working class. We can therefore understand the party as an ever-shifting organization dedicated to historical becoming, instead of taking one of its manifestations, for example, its manifestation in post-revolutionary communist states, as its essence. In this way, the critical theory of Lukach's early works helps us understand the exigencies facing the left today, namely the need for organizations dedicated to the growing consciousness of the exploited, even in countries without a strong working class political movement. So there's something, regardless of what we think about the communist experience, there's something in Lukach's theory of the party that I would argue we on the left ought not to give up, and we give up at our own peril. So the first section is the cultivation of mediation. At the time of its publication, Lukach's History and Class Consciousness was most notable for the way it brought dialectical philosophy to the forefront of Marxist theory. In the years leading up to its composition, the theoretical development of the European workers' movement had taken place against a positivistic background, reflecting the relative integration of the social democratic parties into bourgeois society during the end of the 19th century. The early stages of the working class's integration into capitalist society accompanied an infiltration of bourgeois common sense into socialist theory and praxis. That's how Lukach describes it in 1921. The mechanistic materialism of this time took the basic structure of the recently stabilized bourgeois society for granted, conceiving of the goal of socialist politics then in terms of limited interventions into this order, like the victory of parliamentary parties, the passage of labor legislation, or a depoliticized increase of empirical knowledge of economic laws, for example. So it either saw that as the intervention, or it posited socialism as the inevitable outcome of impersonal historical forces. Against what Lukach would call the political dilution of Marxism, events occurring in the early 20th century, the October Revolution of 1917, the short-lived Hungarian Revolution of 1919, as well as the development of philosophical Marxism in the work of theorists such as Lukach and Karl Korsch, took both bourgeois society and its distinctive forms of conceptuality as systems in crisis, whose dynamics could be understood through attention to their dialectical antagonisms. Against positivist and economic Marxism, Lukach's dialectical Marxism locates the source of theoretical confusion about society's development to social reality itself as a concrete whole. It's in this vein that Lukach criticizes the immediacy of bourgeois consciousness in history and class consciousness. The immediately available categories with which members of capitalist society understand their social existence are themselves understood as products of capitalist social reality, and so incapable in principle of articulating an escape from this reality. The form of objectivity which is immediately available to members of capitalist society mistakes products of historical becoming for stable objects when they're in fact dynamic realities. And in this operation, theoretical consciousness harmonizes with the actual organization of the social world. That's the way Lukach describes it. Imprisoned in the modes of thought created by capitalism, socialist theory and praxis are thus unable to move past the apparent autonomy of individual spheres of social reality. The economy, for example, as separate from the legal system, as separate from civil society, an apparent separation that masks the total interrelation of all aspects of life in capitalist society and its increasing subjection to reification. In the earliest pages of this work, Lukach thus framed his intervention as a critique of bourgeois science, or what Andrew Feenberg and Daniel Andres Lopez call a meta-critique of bourgeois thinking. The aim of this meta-critique is not so much to disprove the bourgeois scientific program on its own terms, as it is to urge socialist authors to eradicate the undialectical remnants of this program from their work. From this perspective, we can understand the struggle against reification as the constant search for the mediation structuring the immediate conceptual manifestations of capitalist society. The development of theoretical consciousness thus seeks to transcend capitalist common sense, demonstrating the historically produced and thus mediated character of ideology. In the pure facts of empirical science, Lukach's materialism grasps products of historical evolution, whose inner structure, as well as any theoretical system produced by their study, masks their true origin in capitalist society. But the success of dereification does not merely depend on a theoretical account of these mediations, since the abstract realities of bourgeois common sense are not only abstract, but also become real through social practice. The goal is thus to develop a socio-historical account of capitalism that can assist in the development of a practical movement that would overthrow this political economic system. It's with the latter goal in mind that Lukach develops his account of class consciousness as the theoretical understanding of society possessed by the class as a whole. Transcending contemporary forms of immediacy, however, requires the account of class consciousness to articulate a difference between the empirical consciousness of the proletariat, or its theoretical self-understanding that people actually possess, and the imputed class consciousness that would be possessed by this class if it were to realize its historical role. Lukach's work thus takes as its theoretical practical aim a movement for the immediate consciousness of the workers' movement to a form of consciousness more fitting to the actions of the leading social class. Following Lenin, the spontaneous consciousness of the workers is understood to limit itself to resolving economic demands within the immediate situation, which results in a trade union conception of the workers' movement in which the consciousness of the labor aristocracy stands for the consciousness of the class. Moving beyond this conception, according to Lukach, requires an organized process through which these close-at-hand aims and tactics are understood with regard to their limits. As Lukach writes in his Defense of History and Class Consciousness, which was unpublished, but probably written around 1925 or 1926, in order to comprehend the function of the labor aristocracy as an obstacle to the development of the revolutionary movement in its entirety, one needs to abandon immediacy and recognize the real dialectical forces that bring forth this immediacy and give it its function in the context of the whole. The objective forms of mediation that remain hidden in a consciousness trapped in immediacy are thus understood with respect to their systematic necessity in capitalist society, opening a realm of what Lukács calls freedom beyond spontaneity. Philosophically, imputation spells out the difference between the immediately given social order and the possibility of a new order built around the needs of humanity, indexing the gap between what is real and what's possible, or the dunamis underlying thesis. Ultimately, this means the possibility of a de-reifying perspective originating within the existing social order. Georgi Marcus thus rightly refers to history and class consciousness's aim as outlining that ladder of social praxis, which would allow not the cognitive individual, but the struggling class to reach, starting from immediacy, the standpoint of its own world historical mission, the standpoint of totality. Again, that's Georgi Marcus. By achieving the standpoint of totality, that task requires the slow movement from the empirical consciousness of the workers' movement to a consciousness more appropriate to its place in the system of social production, a form of consciousness able to understand the objective tendencies of the directly available paths of action. It requires, in other words, an organized process of transcending immediacy. And I want to emphasize it's an organized process here. So, section 2. The organized struggle against immediacy. Scholars who take issue with imputation often accuse Lukács of positing an ideal form of correct consciousness over and above the heads of the proletariat. As more sensitive commentators have countered, however, the term in which his intervention is expressed are historically dynamic. Communism, as Lukács well recognizes, is not a completed project which is ready to be implemented by a social actor, nor is de-reification merely the expression of an already articulated insight. In every case, the development of theoretical consciousness, what we saw Lukács calling the abandonment of immediacy, is recognized as an open-ended project. And from this perspective, the imputed class consciousness of the proletariat is not a system that exists in Lukács's head, much less in Lenin's head, but rather it's a result of the interaction of theoretical consciousness with the world, and particularly with the changing conditions of class struggle. From the aspirations toward totality outlined in Lukács's theoretical reflection, we can also see the way in which the proletariat itself is necessarily a dynamic concept. The notorious unified subject-object of history is in fact a class in development whose unity is as incomplete as its consciousness is limited. At the outset of our consideration of the role of the Revolutionary Party in Lukács's writings, then, it's necessary to note that the process through which this organization realizes its function is necessarily partial. This is already clear in History and Class Consciousness, where Lukács writes that the ideological maturity of the proletariat results from a practical process of development attained through the object lessons of class struggle. The ideological maturity of the class struggle results from a Bildungsprozess of development and cultivation. To the external crises pushing the proletariat to spontaneous action, then, Lukács adds the presence of an inner crisis through which the proletariat's perspective is widened. This ideological crisis of the proletariat, seen this way, is nothing but the exigency pushing this class from its empirical class consciousness to the consciousness adequate to its historical role. But the ideologically mature perspective is not the result of a theoretical clarification or like something that's written in a book, but it's the result of the object lessons of struggle. For this reason, class consciousness is never able to be spelled out once and for all, but must take place through a historical process of adjustment and experimentation. In his early reflections on the role of the party, Lukach outlined the way in which the spontaneous movement of the working class tends to run up against what he calls dead points, where the masses lose their momentum and action ceases. In his 1921 essay on educational work, for example, Lukach writes, "No one who has dispassionately studied the revolutionary period as it has developed so far can shut his eyes to the fact that the most crucial but theoretically and tactically least expected obstacles to the revolution and its victory are not so much the strength of the bourgeoisie as ideological inhibitions within the proletariat itself." The function of the party, with this observation in mind, is to bring an increasing consciousness of the situation to the workers, and in so doing, to supplement the spontaneous action that's natural to a revolutionary situation with a notion of conscious development. This mode of development, as the practical corollary to the theoretical relationship between immediacy and mediation, requires a historical institution that's capable of seeing the pitfalls of the immediately apparent political possibilities, pushing the contradictions encountered here to a higher level in order to facilitate this class's learning. The party is so important for the success of the revolution, according to Lukach, because as a conscious organization, it allows the working class to transcend the immediacy of the workers' movement, developing a conscious side of action that completes its initial emphasis on spontaneity. In the party, spontaneity and consciousness can enter a consciously mediated relationship, in other words. Most interestingly here, we see the way in which the collective that's capable of grasping the revolutionary situation must also develop the revolutionaries who make it up. In this way, the cultivation of the working class's consciousness as a class is dialectically related to the development of the individual members of the party and their organizational capacity. This is first and foremost true because the overcoming of immediacy achieved in a single moment of struggle always threatens to ossify into a new immediacy that limits the consciousness of the workers and their party. Lukach thus writes, "If reification is overcome at one point, the danger immediately arises that the state of consciousness that led to that victory itself might atrophy into a new form of reification. For this reason, the party is the fighting organization that strives to adapt to what Konstantinos Kavoulas calls the constant tendency toward the restoration of reification." The function of the party makes it easy to see why labeling this body as the bearer of imputed class consciousness, as Daniel Andres Lopez does, is only partially helpful. While it is certainly the case that the party represents the organizational expression of the proletariat's consciousness and its intentional organization allows it to combat spontaneity in the way outlined by Lenin, it's also true that the struggle between imputed consciousness and empirical consciousness occurs within the party itself. So it's not like everybody in the party is totally clear. It's actually, there's a struggle happening within the party. This is the meaning of Lukach's repeated emphasis in this essay that the party is concerned with the development of individuals and their overcoming of capitalist conditioning. The party, as he says, consists necessarily of men who have been brought up in and ruined by capitalist society. He writes, "These tendencies, like tendencies to ossification, will necessarily persist in the Communist Party, which after all has never claimed to be able to reform the inner nature of its members by means of a miracle. And this is all the truer for the fact that the requirements of purposeful action also compel the party to introduce the division of labor to a considerable degree, and this inevitably invokes the dangers of ossification, bureaucratization, and corruption. The inner life of the party is one unceasing struggle against this, its capitalist inheritance." The party is not simply superior to the capitalist inheritance, but it provides a concrete organization through which these tendencies can be combated. From this perspective, the often noted issues relating to organizational rigidity, which are often seen as fatal problems for theories of the party, are actually understood as factors stemming directly from capitalism's structuring influence on the social whole. According to Lukach, people cannot go from being deformed, mutilated by capitalism to ideologically capable of grasping the social whole overnight. And the organization of the party is actually first and foremost meant to facilitate that learning process. From this aspect of Lukach's party essay, we can see how this institution is not seen as a dogmatic possessor of imputed class consciousness, so much as a learning organization. As Lukach writes in his 1924 Lenin book, in no sense is it the party's role to impose any kind of abstract, cleverly devised tactics upon the masses. On the contrary, it must continuously learn from their struggle and their conduct of it. But it must remain active while it learns, preparing the next revolutionary undertaking, end quote. The rigor and discipline of the party organization pertains then first and foremost to this function as the facilitator of the proletariat's Bildung. The party's refinement of revolutionary consciousness consists in this, its development of a view of the totality of capitalist society, through which it brings the infamous outside from which revolutionary theory must enter the proletariat ever closer to the heart of this class without displacing the class's fundamental antagonism to capitalism. So finally, just a couple of reflections. The party and becoming in the worker state. Lukach's treatment of the party stresses the importance of this organization in a total process of the proletariat's becoming conscious. In the same way that his interventions into orthodox Marxist theory emphasize the dynamic aspect of society's interrelations. At this point, we can see that the problems often located in Lukács's theory of the party stem from the tendency to diagnose its problematic features from the historical experience of communist parties in power. We can see then that the distance between Lukács's conception of the party as an adaptable kind of open-ended supporter of proletarian Bildung and the reality of much of communist experience can be understood as a historical difference between different phases in the struggle for communism. On the one hand, and we can take this from Lenin's State and Revolution, for example. On the one hand, we have a learning organization dedicated to the cultivation of clarity among the working class so that it might gain the power to win the class struggle. But on the other hand, we have what Lenin would call the transition to a higher stage of communism, taken from Marx's critique of the Gotha program, in which the proletariat controls the state and its bureaucratic machinery, pending its eventual withering away. The inflection point is obviously here the seizure of state power. A core difficulty for Marxist theory and praxis thus lies in how to maintain the flexibility of proletarian organization after this point, so that they may facilitate what Lenin called the cultivation of new habits among the people, or the growth of generations accustomed to life not lived under capitalism. In Lukach, we encounter a theorist well attuned to this problem, in which this problem becomes properly historical. But we also see the need expressed here as in other theorists of this time period for the organized attempt to develop the consciousness of the exploited. How can the learning institutions of the working class, substantially oriented towards this class's ascendancy, maintain their flexibility when the balance of power shifts, when the class actually gains power? It's in this philosophical question, and not in the rejection of organization as such, that political problems of contemporary importance lie. So yeah, that's it. Thanks. I guess I'm under time still, so thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ian. All right, so let's go ahead then. I'll turn it over to Anita and we can get started, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for conversation.
Great. Thanks, Brandon, for this invitation. And thank you, Ian, for a rich talk. I really enjoyed it. So, actually, just to build a little bridge here between what Ian was saying, I too have been very interested in the Lukácsian theme of reification as a key to understanding dimensions of the neoliberal political and subjective landscape. So for Lukács, of course, the concept of reification developed this Marxian problematic of commodity fetishism and focused more centrally on its subjective dimensions. Above all, the way that the commodity form creates what I would call a dissociative form of subjectivity that cannot recognize its own participation in the social world that it constructs through labor, both mental and manual. More recently, my research into reification has taken me into the realm of contemporary art as a space where the critique of reification can take a new form in engaging with labor and with materiality, approaching a more haptic and tactile dimension. I'm currently writing a book on the conceptual art collective Claire Fontaine, which explores the contributions of their work to contemporary critical theory, dramatizing the hierarchy of mental over manual labor, the fetishism of the commodity form, and the violence of abstract and formalistic thought. And this is the work that I would like to share with you today. So central to their work and their project is the project of defunctionalizing knowledge. Part of why I'm interested, just to say a little bit about Claire Fontaine and who they are, part of why I'm interested in thinking about Claire Fontaine as a theorist, so really not just as an artist, but as someone who's entering, as a collective that's entering into a theoretical conversation, is that her work provokes a thrilling disorientation in the realm of questions about the production of knowledge. She's a self-declared ready-made artist, a trickster that subverts the rules of what art, but also of what theory should be. She's made up of two individuals, Fulvia Carnevale and James Thornhill, but works as a singular collective subject. Lifted from a brand of ubiquitous French stationery, her name marks her as a female person of French nationality. But the name Claire Fontaine means clear fountain, a reference to the artist Marcel Duchamp's famous ready-made, not his favorite, famous ready-made, a urinal that he declared to be a fountain. Claire Fontaine is never to be seen. We only encounter her humble artist's assistant, desublimating the exalted, fetishized, and idealized picture of artistic labor that we often have, and revealing it for what it also is, a form of care work that involves countless competencies that are poorly remunerated and often unrecognized. She's an artist, but also an intellectual, and she sees no conflict between these identities, neither a need to combine them nor to differentiate them fully. For Claire Fontaine, the undefined space of contemporary art is a context where the hierarchy between theoretical and aesthetic expression can be disarticulated, and both of these registers can be inhabited with equal intensity. Yet calling her an artist may at times seem as arbitrary as any other title, because Claire Fontaine's project is perhaps above all a struggle for what she calls the defunctionalization of subjectivities, that of the artist included. Defunctionalization is a process of rendering artists, artworks, and commodities non-functional within their systems of circulation. It is a misuse of the artist's proper role. No longer instrumental, the artist's value will ultimately be revealed by her uselessness. Akin to Jacques Rancière's Desensual Moments, the act of defunctionalizing subjectivities is a process of disentangling subjects from the dynamics of power that shape them and render them productive. So in this time, I want to speak to the role that defunctionalizing knowledge plays in Claire Fontaine's work as a strategy that redeems knowledge by generating new uses for it. This gesture reverses the hierarchy between mental and manual labor through a feminist critique of production, and in so doing, reignites a potential for collective subjectivity that is decimated by neoliberal practices of knowledge production. Claire Fontaine is often fascinated by subjects that are discarded, illegible, foreign, cracked, useless, quote unquote, and displaced. She sees herself in their image, as we can see in many of her works that explore such themes. For example, from F. Scott Fitzgerald's Crack Up to Bartleby's I'd Prefer Not to the feminist politics of Carla Lonzi. This aspiration to defunctionalize subjectivity also guides Claire Fontaine's approach to knowledge. Just as much as the artists defunctionalize artworks, which within the space of the art market always profit precisely from the subverted use value of their subjectivities, they also defunctionalize knowledge itself. This gesture, which is at the heart of the logic of the ready-made as Duchamp first conceived it, stems firstly from the inappropriate use of spaces, objects, and ideas. This happens through a process of defamiliarization as well as a defunctionalization of both the art object and the artist as subject. Claire Fontaine draws on a long lineage of defunctionalizing practices in art. We can see the imprint of Brecht's Verfremdungseffekt, the estrangement effect in this gesture, which had made the task of revolutionary art the rupture and reconstitution of emotional identification between the audience and events in a dramatic work. This emotional distancing allowed for unconscious elements of identification to become conscious in the experience of the audience, empowering them to bring a transformed intellectual empathy to the realm of praxis. The structures of desire, compulsion, and attraction of the artwork are revealed rather than hidden, thereby destabilizing the dynamics of power between the creator and spectator of the work. The work addresses the public directly, removing the illusion on the part of the audience that they are the unseen spectator of the event. We can see a crystallized theatricality in Claire Fontaine's work that has parallels to the effects that Brecht was researching in the field of drama. Like Chekhov's gun, her objects indicate actions, whether in the past or yet to come. And I'll show you some of those objects in just a bit. In her own vernacular, Claire Fontaine translates this estrangement effect into what she calls salvatory defamiliarization. Salvatory defamiliarization. And just to speak to a quote from their work, because they have an immense theoretical production as well as artistic, they argue that art can be understood, quote, as a space for the defunctionalization of subjectivities. Singularities emerge there, emancipated from any utility. As a purely aesthetic space, the world of art harbors a potential critique of the general organization of society and of the organization of work in particular. Perhaps we could put it this way: the very gesture of wanting to produce something original, indeed to be something, someone original, implicates us in a denial of contemporary social conditions of production. If this is true for artists, it's equally true for intellectuals. Would we even bother to deny the homogenization of knowledge that results from the manic acceleration induced in us to publish and produce, that drives us even when we write about the most radical of subjects, be it decoloniality, feminism, or neoliberalism? Surely we must admit that the entrepreneurial logic of contemporary marketing compels us to brand ourselves in every dimension of our lives. As intellectuals, artists, workers of all kinds, we are functional to the processes that we criticize through the very forms in which we engage in critique. The strategy of subversion, whether in the realm of art or intellectual production, according to Claire Fontaine, is not to search for new ways to infuse the products of our intellectual and artistic creativity with novelty. This attempt, which can only be futile, is a process of investing our own bodies and subjectivities with the at once homogenizing and simultaneously pluralizing logic of the commodity, which ensnares us within the loop of entrepreneurial subjectivity and self-branding. Working to create novelty for the sake of novelty in our work, Claire Fontaine shows, we participate in capital's logic of expropriation. It is a form of primitive accumulation of the mind, akin to the process Marx described of the privatization of the common lands in the 17th century, whereby what was previously public and shared became owned, no longer part of a general societal inheritance. Capitalism is the ceaseless unfolding of this logic of primitive accumulation, where at every turn it finds new sites of privatization and commodification. Our subjectivities furnish an endless source of material for this commodification, as we ourselves are produced by capital. We discover new sites of self-commodification within, in our brains, our erotic lives, our serotonin and dopamine levels, and our attention. Franco Berardi describes this process in The Soul at Work, his book, The Soul at Work, suggesting that in this neoliberal horizon, quote, every fragment of mental activity must be transformed into capital. But there is another possibility within this order of things. For Claire Fontaine, the first step in subverting this problem, which is an ongoing struggle, is to recognize that we are all objectified within this schema. We are all of us ready-mades. If we are all ready-mades, we can see our work in a different light. Rather than participating in what is ultimately capital's logic of primitive accumulation by reinforcing our singularity and novelty, we recognize that the creative process is always already inescapably enmeshed within the logic of expropriation. As the critic Tom McDonough observes, the artist Claire Fontaine's signature strategy is one of what he calls expropriation, as opposed to the traditional artistic gesture of appropriation. So appropriation would be the turn beginning in the late 70s towards the reproduction of existing materials and objects as a strategy for critiquing modernist understandings of authorship, and as a way of intervening within hierarchical discourses of mainstream art institutions. And it's a form of critique that has become integrated into the very art institutions that the strategy was created to resist. Expropriation, by contrast, both brings found objects, materials, and concepts into the realm of artistic production, and then also forces them back out into the realm of praxis. The ready-made is an artistic and intellectual strategy that responds directly to the reality of expropriation. Instead of unconsciously affirming expropriative logics through the inescapable logic of self-branding and the copyright of the mind that accompanies our commitment to the singularity of liberal subjectivity, the ready-made offers itself up not as unique, but as a banal and naked object, paradoxically restored to the commons through its status as art. The ready-made is a commodity among other commodities, exposed and transparent. And the artist herself is a commodified laborer among other laborers. The work of art and the work of intellectual production are then reimagined as processes of redemption, restoring that which has already been privatized and expropriated back to the commons. So I want to show a few images right now, just to give you a sense of some of these works. So okay, sorry, I just want to. Sorry, having some issues here. Okay, so hopefully you can see one of their works, which is called the Brickbats series. And I'm just gonna try to, okay, I'm having a problem here. So let me just talk through this a little bit. So this is a work from the Brickbats series, which is basically a series of bricks that they've covered in covers of radical works of philosophy and theory. So this one, for example, is from Marx and Engels' collective works. And we can see that it's a display of these bricks, which look very much like books, kind of displayed in a sort of sculpturally minimalist sort of style, evoking, mimicking, but also taking the piss out of the minimalism of an artist such as Carl Andre, for example, who's really trying to work with the nakedness of materials and decontextualizing them in a certain way. Here, what we see actually to the contrary is this way of taking these brute objects, bricks, which have many significations, of course, and sort of playing with the relationship between works of theory, works of knowledge, right? And we could see, I think there's a real ambiguity here in terms of how we might understand this artwork. If we think about the bricks themselves, right, they're quite useful in a way as, on the one hand, weapons. On the other hand, I think when we think of them as works of theory, right, we start to think about, well, what's really lost here? What's the power of thought, right? What's the capacity of thought to actually intervene in material reality in the realm of praxis, right? And so I think this kind of ambiguity is really at the heart of what they're trying to do with the relationship between theory and praxis, right? And as well as with what happens when we defunctionalize thought to create a certain redemption of thought for other purposes. So let me show another work of theirs, which is called May Our Enemies Not Prosper, and it's a text file. But this is a work that they have many such text files, actually. So it's and usually what these are, in this case, we can see it's a stack of papers, right? And these papers have a kind of manifesto printed on them. In this case, it's called May Our Enemies Not Prosper. And there's an evocation of the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres, who also played very much with this form of the text file, which I think is very interesting. But here we can see it's like there's a kind of fluorescent color to the pile. It has an almost kind of hippie looking vibe. And you have this sense of the idea of just distributing, you come to distribute knowledge for free, right? Which in a way is a kind of relationship with knowledge that we've lost contact of in our current schema of the internet and the way in which the gentrification of knowledge that comes with needing to provide always identifying material that subjects us to surveillance every time we want to partake in someone else's knowledge, right? So I think it's also very interesting in terms of a kind of relationship between the object and the kind of body of theory that it's trying to set up. This is a text file that's comprised of manifestos, right? And the idea is that when you go there, you can take one, and then after a certain amount of time, the sculpture will actually dissolve into the particles of the knowledge that has been given away freely. So I'll just stop the share here. So I think here, I think there's a polarity that emerges between these two possibilities presented on the one hand by the brickbats and the text piles on the other hand, which is thought as dead weight, right? Thought with the bricks, right? And thought with the capacity to impact material conditions also with those bricks. And so there's this undecidability between these possibilities that is part of the ready-made project of defetishizing citations. As Claire Fontaine writes in one of their texts, there is a constant attempt on our part to defetishize references. Just through its mere presence, the reference can overshadow the intention of hijacking or dethroning it. We employ references because they have a use value for us, not an added value. We try to pursue a form of research through the means of dispossession to work on and from our weaknesses. So that's from Claire Fontaine. So this strategy of using references to dethrone and defetishize theoretical knowledge owes much to the situationist technique of détournement. Détournement extracts the critique of ideology from the privatization of knowledge through the playful repetition of references, be they artistic or intellectual, freed from their original context through changing one or more elements of that original, creating new combinations and meanings. The ultimate objective of détournement is to forget the original, paradoxically by invoking it as an element of conscious or semi-conscious recollection of the original context of the elements. This flexible language of anti-ideology is vocalized through the refusal to conceive the process of creative production as emanating from the privatized liberal subject. Instead, through the lens of the ready-made, artistic production can be seen as a reversal of expropriation. In a world in which our knowledge, passion, and impulses are always already privatized, the ready-made, through its utter nudity and transparency, carries this knowledge back to the commons. So there's much, much more to say about all of this, but I just want to conclude by mentioning that the implications for the politics of knowledge production in Claire Fontaine's work has many parallels with what I see in Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's notion of the undercommons. What we can see in Claire Fontaine's work is the necessity of undercutting the hierarchy of mental over manual labor, as well as resuscitating the possibility of collective subjectivity within knowledge production through experimenting with form, as they can do because they're working in the realm of art, through forms such as text files, such as brickbats, such as manifestos, which are a big part of the theoretical production, all of which are in different ways resisting the gentrification of knowledge. Finally, this critique of mental and manual labor takes us into a feminist critique of production, as articulated by feminists who are a great influence on them, including Carla Lonzi, Silvia Federici, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, and Selma James. But for that conversation, we'll have to wait for another time. So with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you both for such interesting talks. I have myself quite a few questions. We already have a couple of really great ones on Facebook, so I'm going to start there. Let's see, we have one question. It says, it's for both of you, and the person says they're interested in the affective dimensions of groups and collectives. What role does affective subjectivity play in political organization and aesthetic production? And I think in both cases that affective subjectivity that he's referring to would be collective. So if you both want to kind of talk about the affective, and it might be useful, Iaan, as well, for you to address the aesthetic more broadly, since it was so strongly a part of what Anita was doing, but not necessarily evoked directly in your own work.
Well, I could speak to the affective, because I think, for me, it's really, it's a central point for me. It's a central motivation really for even wanting to go do this work with Claire Fontaine, actually, because what I see is the possibility of when we experiment with form in theory, which I think is crucial for being able to kind of access the more embodied level of theoretical production and really aim at the kind of perceptual dimensions of critique, right? Because I think, and this is, I think this dovetails actually with some of what Iaan was speaking about in terms of the party as a kind of educational, an educational space, right? But one with a very specific kind of education. It's like, for me, the question has always, and what really drove me to want to look at Claire Fontaine's work has always been, how do we start to talk about those kinds of deeper perceptual questions, right? How do we start to talk about the more the affective dimensions really of ambivalence that come up when we're thinking about transformation within capitalist society? I think a big part of what Claire Fontaine is interested in is at the same time, a question of how our attachment to forms of domination and commodification within capitalist society are part of very much how we survive. At the same time, they make subjective transformation at one level contradictory or impossible, right? So how then do we start to work within that kind of affective knot? And I think that's what their work is actually very useful for, because it doesn't actually force us to somehow try to bypass that or choose one side of that equation, right? Either, it's like either we impute some kind of class consciousness, right? Or on the other hand, we're stuck in a kind of, we're stuck simply in a place where we can't acknowledge our real affective needs, right? So I think also, to me, affect also takes us into the realm of the body and really having to ask questions about the body's relationship to perception and the relationship of both those levels to critique. And I think one problem that we have is just our theoretical language. However much we talk about the body or however much we want to talk about affect within the realm of critical theory is not well suited actually to accessing those levels, And so what I think happens is within critical subjectivity, there's a schism that happens. And so what I appreciate so much in the work of Claire Fontaine is being able to move beyond those schisms, refuse some of the blackmails of dialectics, and really be able to speak about what it takes to work within that realm.
Yeah, I guess what I would say to that is that it's a thing that I'm really interested in thinking about, particularly from the perspective of, when Lukach talks about how people are ruined by capitalist society, and you can also see, in State and Revolution, which I was talking about, there's a continual reference to how kind of like presaging, right? Like if people don't live under capitalism, they will actually develop a different capacity for sensibility if in a non-capitalist world. I think that that's true, right? Historically, that's really the case for people who didn't grow up under capitalism, right? We have even, for example, like the really interesting affective phenomenon of like nostalgie, right? Like the people who lived in the Eastern Bloc and after capitalism like came, to the Eastern Bloc, they feel like real nostalgia for it because it's a world that is actually different. And it's not just different in the sense of there's a different institution, you get your bread at a different place, but it's different on the level of actually what is possible for you to hope for, right? What you're thinking, what you're dreaming about, what your imagination is doing, right? So I think that there's a lot of room to actually think about this. Another thing that I would say is that like there's another kind of leg of this project that would actually relate Lukach's theory of the party to Walter Benjamin's thinking, which I think actually they're not that inconsistent. Sometimes when Anita, during your talk, I was thinking about how it sounds like Benjamin at certain points to me, at least. I'm thinking about like rendering kind of like defunctionalizing this kind of movement is kind of Benjaminian, I guess, in a certain sense. And I guess, for Benjamin, education, which is really a persistent focus of his early work, and in a way that I think is not at all actually at odds with what I'm talking about in Lukach, especially not in like the program for a proletarian children's theater, for example. Like they're really, we're thinking about educational processes in terms of the experiences that they make possible. And it's not like a conceptual concept. It's not like a conceptual way of thinking about experience. It's really in terms of that there's actually a different sensibility that's able to be cultivated through a kind of context, like the proletarian educational context. That's what he calls it at that time. And he's, in that he's inspired by his like collaboration and relationship with Asya Lachis, who's like a Bolshevik theater director and artist who's actually designing theater programs for children in the early days of the Soviet Union. So, I think that there's a lot of work there as well to think about the way in which organizations actually can support the sort of development or cultivation of a different form of sensibility. And that's like a sensibility that's actually able to see the limits of this And then in other, I mean, like to go back to what I was saying initially, it's on the one hand, it's developing a new sensibility, but then on the other hand, there's also a level on which there are people actually who already have, they come to America and they're like, this is unbearable. Like capitalism is horrible, right? There is a way in which actually people already have that sensibility. And so it also requires kind of an openness to others, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another here, and I think that it's directed, but it's very similar. So I'm gonna, I think maybe we already answered it. And if we have, Anita, you can tell me. I think it's directed more directly toward you, and it says that they want to ask if the rendering of subjectivity as non-functional through art means that revolutionary praxis is purely an affective or collective matter, and whether that means that revolutionary art can only ever be produced in a kind of para or pseudo-subjective stance. And I guess this is referring especially to the idea that Claire Fontaine is this collective subject, but a singular name and so on.
So in the sense of para or pseudo-subjective stance, meaning only like as in Claire Fontaine being this sort of collective that writes under the name of an adopted almost avatar identity. And, I think the fact is, no, I don't think so, because I do think that's one way and they've chosen to kind of infiltrate the world of art, I think through that kind of a subjectivity. But on the other hand, I don't know that I think that what they're doing is contaminating practices from other realms that allow us to see different kinds of possibilities for entering, such that, I think it's true. Like when you think about the question of how would we begin to do work within the intellectual realm that starts to introduce similar kinds of subversions and oppositions to what they're bringing. I think they build a kind of scaffolding for us to be doing different kinds of work within critical theory. And yeah, maybe I don't think we can't, those possibilities aren't necessarily as open to us as intellectuals or don't have the same force, right? We, of course, Claire Fontaine is comprised of people who were before that. Fulvia Carnavale, for example, was working, in Tikkun, producing in theoretical collectives, right, that were producing work that has been definitely brought into the realm of knowledge production and critical theory and academic production, right, and has had a big impact in that way. You think of, the Invisible Committee and work like that really is through a kind of collective, the creation of a collective subject articulated through a manifesto, for example, is shattering some of the kind of overly privatized, reified ways of doing knowledge production from the realm of just the liberal subject, right, who has a copyright over their knowledge, right? And it's a very complex issue. But I don't think that it's limited to that. I think that there are also really practical dimensions of what they're talking about that go beyond the realm of, art or even critical theory. I think some of what they're talking about is really how do we practically, affectively survive in this situation? How do we sustain ourselves in the midst of what is affectively unbearable? And I think some of those dimensions enter into more of the perceptual politics of how do we start to perceive different options for subjectivity. And then I think that's not just a matter of where we write from, or the kind of way that we want to perform subjectivity, but really practically, like, how do we shift our relationships with one another?
Yeah, that's a really important and interesting set of questions. I will say from my point of view, and this comment can be left on the floor or taken up as you please, but to me, that set of questions, arises very specifically with respect to the university as an organization and institution in our society and the forms of subjectivity it produces and demands. That goes back to your comments about the undercommons as well, Anita. One thing I noticed in both of your works or kind of a tension I kind of want to draw out maybe. You mentioned, Iaan, moments of ideological crisis maybe that provoke these moments of learning so that there's some sense of conflict of things not working, things not fitting, and maybe I'm misreading you or mishearing you, but that was my understanding. And this is where the learning process sort of begins, as in that moment of crisis. And I noticed, Anita, you also mentioned, we have the idea of defunctionalization and defamiliarization. So these ways of standing apart from that, I think in a way can produce a certain kind of crisis, or are designed to produce a certain kind of crisis. At the same time, you mentioned dissociative subjectivity. So there's a sense of dissociation from your own performance or your own practice or your own being. So it strikes me then we have multiple levels of estrangement or dissociation at play, one of which is incredibly important and productive, and another of which is like incredibly destructive, right? And one form allows you to see what's happening around you and learn from it, and another form is I think Iaan used the language of mutilation. And I wonder if you could kind of develop out that the interplay between these things of forms of dissociation, estrangement. I know you brought up Franco Berardi as well. He talks about this quite a bit too. So I would just like to hear a little bit more about how those two things interplay and interact.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I mean, I think how you put that is so useful, actually. And when, how I think about that between the forms of dissociation that are damaging and that that we are resisting, and then on the other hand, to understand that in critical practices themselves, we then make use of a level of the poison, almost a homeopathic dimension of trying to access and make contact with what needs to be understood and felt and transformed. When I think about it that way, I mean, that does actually take me into a kind of Benjaminian terrain in the sense of, I think it's a question also about mimesis and critique, and a question of to what extent we're in a place of just mimicry of the dominating dimensions of capitalist society. And then on the other hand, there's a mimesis that actually allows for a form of contact, which then through that contact allows for a different possibility to emerge in subjectivity. And so to me, that's where those two levels can play out, right? Because it's not just that we have dissociation and we're mimicking a toxic form of dissociation, right? It's that there's a process of engaging in it in a contactful way such that we have that shift that I think, in a way is very aligned with what Lukach says in many ways, right? That's a kind of mediating moment. So that's how I see it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would also just, I guess to kind of riff off of that in a certain way, it's clear, I mean, the ideological crisis and a material, like economic crisis and ideological crisis are, I mean, we're living through it right now. I think it's very clear that the way that people are trying to make sense of the social world doesn't work, that, I mean, yeah, I don't know, like, aside from all of the evictions that are happening, like millions of people are about to be cut off from Medicaid in all 50 states because the federal public health emergency is going to end at some point. So like millions of people are about to lose their health insurance, just like that. And that's like something that like people in a position, like, I don't mean to bring it up just like to be contemporary, right, in a certain way, but there is a very real sense, I think, in which in a time like this, where there's just like an astounding amount of dislocation and kind of dispossession and sort of like people are kind of put out there by themselves. I mean, it's really a disaster in this country, the way that it is for people. In a condition like that, people look for ways to make sense of it, right? I mean, I think that that's kind of what the ideological crisis of the proletariat is. It's what it is in our context, right? I think in Lukach's context, it's something quite a bit more developed because there's a real labor movement in the time when Lukach is writing. There's actually organizations of the working class. There's a communist party. There's, like different kind of tendencies in the party. They're able to kind of, the ideological crisis attains a pretty high degree of sophistication. But in our time, I think we have to look at it on that level of people really like noticing, and through like pain and suffering, noticing that what's going on is this is not my society. Like whatever this is, it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't have tools to make sense of it. And I think that there's a real, as we were kind of hinting, there's like a danger there. There's like a very destructive possibility. I mean, if you look at, like, for example, the way that right-wing cable news has been like changing their programming and stuff like that. There's like, it's all kind of set up to bring people into kind of fascist, like neo-fascist movement, you know, I mean, like, and it speaks exactly to those kinds of resentments that people have. But then on the other hand, you know, people can express frustration or these kind of very deeply kind of anti-system ways of thinking about things, like, oh, you know, like no one cares about us, or like politicians aren't going to save us, etc. And I think that it's really the job of working class organization, and you see actually organizations that are doing this right now in the United States, to not like correct that, right? Like not to just be like, no, Joe Biden is like really great for you, right? But to actually provide like a place for that kind of expression that people have, to get developed further into something else, and not a fascist something else, but as something else that actually like points the way out of the crisis. So, I mean, I think that that's maybe, again, like it's hard to apply this to Lukach, because I think Lukach is writing in just such a different context where the working class movement is just, I mean, so much more developed than what's going on here. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's the way that I would try to think about it. It's almost like you know, these kind of ideological ways that the reflexes that we have kind of to deal with how horrible everything is, can be like the basis of community, can be the basis of developing organization in a long-term process, with the right kind of organization, with an organization that actually is oriented towards supporting people affectively through that learning process, I would say.
Yeah, I really like that. I think, at least from my point of view, I'll chime in a little bit, and then I know we're kind of running out of time, but it strikes me too that, you know, one of the things that both from the kind of at the bodily and affective level, you see, you know, there's resignation, fatalism, guilt, shame, embarrassment, as sort of ways of responding to a sense of failure, right? That the failure is my own rather than that of the system, and then that failure, that somehow the system could never have, you know, delivered, and it's impossible. So opening up spaces of possibility, I think, Anita, you talked about this as well, opening up spaces of possibility where one can have a sense that things don't have to be just this way. Okay, well, we're at 5:02. Would you want to take a couple more minutes, or you feel pretty good?
Happy to stay on if there are other questions or thoughts. Yeah.
Stay on.
Well, one final thing. Well, so here there's a mention of Jody Dean's book, Crowds and Party, but only I think just to say, hey, what do you think about it? Or, you know, how does it apply to what you have said? So if you have thoughts that you want to articulate on that matter, in response to this Facebook post, that's an option. Aside from that, I have a kind of, I guess, I wonder about Marcuse and the way Marcuse can come into both of your discussions. This is, I guess, a personal, you know, one of my, yeah, I just like Marcuse. I like reading Marcuse. I think it's very helpful for me. And it seems to me that it intersects with what you both had to say quite a lot, particularly around the question of the new sensibility, and the concept of opening up the sensibility through focus on an aesthetic dimension that is liberated from any kind of utility, that whether political, social, or otherwise. If either of you wanted to respond to that, I'd be interested to hear it.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, even though I don't reference Marcuse directly, I mean, he's definitely in the back of my mind, and definitely on that point, you know, of the importance of the aesthetic, but also I think how he grasps so crucially the libidinal dimension, and about how eros really has to be, the resuscitation of eros in labor and in relationship has to be a part of combating the death drive, basically, or the kind of encroaching of the death drive, you know, if we think about it in terms of eros and civilization. And I think I think that's a crucial point. I think that the sense that if labor is both like mechanized and dehumanizing, even if in the dimensions of care labor, and the fact that all dimensions of pleasure are being kind of funneled and redirected or commodified and captured in a way that has to be a crucial part of how we shift the situation, and not just in labor for sure, but I think in all the different realms, which is why I think also in the realm of critique, in the realm of intellectual production, like the realm of pleasure needs to be resuscitated, and I think that's one reason why I go to Clairefontaine, actually, to think about art as a site of play and experimentation, and also of utopia, but understanding that utopia or escape, it's sometimes needed in a totally damaging environment, and yet to understand it in its place, to understand when we need to go towards it and when we need to be more in the imminent realm of shifting relationships in the present moment.
The question of Jodi Dean's book, I think that there's a lot of ways in which what I'm doing is kind of parallel to that, or like kind of in a similar movement to that, because of the fact that, a thing that I really appreciate about that book is that it really gets into like in a very serious way, like going through the different dimensions of kind of a rejection of the crowd, or the rejection of the mass in turn of the century, not only psychology, not only in psychoanalysis, but also in sociology, right? And thinkers like Robert Michels, right? There's like a really kind of strong pushback in that book against that. And particularly, like, a thing that I like about it is the way in which the unconscious dimensions of the crowd, like that is actually seen as being like as a generative dimension, right? Like as an important thing. This is not why we can't have nice things kind of thing, but actually that the unconscious way in which people can be together in an organization like a party becomes actually exactly why we need this kind of thing. I would also say, I'm just thinking about the critique of Michels in there, and on all of the kind of general thinking, because I think that a lot of the thinking on the left about parties and organization is kind of informed by this belief that, whatever organization there is, it's going to become dogmatic, it's going to become terrible over time, and this is just kind of the fate. And it really comes from Michels and from the iron law of oligarchy is what he calls it. But I would say, like, that a thing that I appreciate about Dean's work, but also like a thing that I have kind of been thinking about myself, is the way in which precisely actually dogmatism in organizations is exactly the work that has to happen on the left, right? Like that actually it's not like an iron law or like a inevitable necessity of organization, but it is actually precisely the struggle that the working class has to enter. And I think Lukach understands this very well. I mean, for all of the talk about him being a dogmatic party theorist, if you read the essay on organization, it's really nothing like that. He's the first person to point out the tendency towards ossification, the tendency towards dogmatic just acceptance of kind of like what the people up above say. He's the first person to recognize that, and the first person to I don't mean first like he did it first, but he's a really prominently doing that in that essay. And also thinking about ways to struggle against it. I mean, that's like a thing that I think is also really, really cool about the Jodi Dean text. Yeah, I mean, about Marcuse, yeah, I would say, like, and Anita, I think you said a lot already, and it was great. So I don't have, I guess, too many thoughts about that to add.
Well, I think we probably should go ahead and end it there. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. I think this is really stimulating, and I think the folks on Facebook agree with me. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, Brandon, so much. And thanks, Ian.
Thank you so much, everybody.